I've worked security at the Riverside Shipyard in Louisiana for close to a year now. It's the kind of job that makes you feel like a ghost, watching over a place long past its prime, forgotten by the world, yet still standing. The shipyard was once a hub for trade and industry, but now it's just a sprawling wasteland of rusted hulls and decaying machinery, a graveyard for ships that will never sail again. I like the quiet, I like the isolation, but something about last week changed the way I feel about this place. It started with the front gate. My shift starts at 10 p.m., ends at 6 a.m. By the time I get here, the last of the daytime workers have already gone home, leaving behind a few floodlights flickering weakly against the darkness. My job is simple: walk the perimeter, check the locks, and make sure no one's stupid enough to break in, looking for scrap metal or a place to hide. I always begin my rounds at the main gate, a pair of heavy steel doors chained shut with a padlock the size of my fist. Every night I check that lock, twice, before moving on. I've got a routine, and I stick to it. That night, the gate was wide open. At first I thought maybe one of the daytime workers had forgotten to close it, but that didn't make sense. I had been the one to lock it the night before, and it's not the kind of thing you just forget. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam bouncing off the metal, making the rust glow a dull orange. The lock was still looped through the chain, but it was unlatched. Someone had opened it. Someone had been here. A cold prickle ran up the back of my neck, that animal instinct that tells you something is wrong before your brain can fully understand why. I told myself it was just a mistake, locked the gate again, and forced the thought out of my mind. But that wasn't the last time it happened. The next night, I checked the gate first thing, still locked, good. But when I came back an hour later, wide open again. Now I was sure someone was messing with me. I radioed dispatch, but the signal was garbage out here, nothing but static. Typical. This place was too far out, surrounded by nothing but water and weeds. If something happened, I was on my own. I started my rounds again, this time hyper-aware of every shadow, every whisper of wind between the cargo containers. The shipyard is big, rows of rusting ships, some half dismantled, others looming like ghosts in the moonlight. There's the dry docks, the storage lots, and the old maintenance sheds where workers used to repair engines before the place was abandoned. I kept my flashlight high, scanning the dark corners between the hulking machinery. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, just the creeping sense that someone was watching me. I locked the gate again. This time I triple-checked it, but the feeling never left me. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was already on edge. This time, I started with the gate. Locked. Good. I did my usual rounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see something there. A shadow moving just beyond my flashlight's reach. A figure ducking out of sight behind the rotting hulls. It wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that I heard it. A soft, scraping sound. It was coming from the far end of the shipyard, near the old dry dock, a place I rarely had reason to check. The noise was faint, like metal dragging against metal. I hesitated. I should have called it in, but the radio wouldn't work out here, and there was no way in hell I was going to wait 6 more hours wondering if I was losing my mind. I started walking toward the noise. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling became, that gut-wrenching certainty that I was not alone. I rounded a rusted shipping container, my flashlight cutting through the dark. That's when I saw him. A man, crouched between 2 containers, partially hidden in the shadows. For a second, we just stared at each other. He was dressed in black, face smeared with grease or dirt, making it impossible to see any features. But what I did see sent a jolt of adrenaline straight through me, a heavy wrench gripped tightly in his hand. He had been waiting for me. I barely had time to react before he lunged. The wrench whistled through the air, missing my skull by inches. I swung my baton, aiming for his arm, but he was fast. Too fast for a guy who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He came at me again, this time aiming for my ribs. I jumped back, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. I swung again, this time catching him in the shoulder. He stumbled, the wrench clattering to the ground. That was my chance. I grabbed my radio, smashing the distress button, hoping, praying that dispatch could hear me through the static. The man looked up, and for the first time I saw his eyes. There was nothing human in them, just cold calculation, hunger, desperation. He started to run. but before he could make it far, I tackled him, sending both of us crashing into the muddy ground. He thrashed, kicking wildly, feral like an animal caught in a trap. Then, sirens. Backup. The moment he heard them, the fight left him. He went limp, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I rolled off of him, pressing my boot to his back as the police arrived. Turned out he wasn't alone. The cops found two more guys hiding in the abandoned maintenance shed, tools and stolen copper wiring stashed in a backpack. They had been watching me for weeks, studying my routine, figuring out when I'd be most vulnerable. The man who attacked me had planned to knock me out, maybe worse, while the others ransacked the shipyard for anything valuable. They almost got away with it. I've worked a lot of security jobs. I've dealt with drunks, thieves, even the occasional tweaker looking for a place to crash. But this was different. Because this time, I hadn't just stumbled onto a crime. I had been the target. Or, every night, when I walk the perimeter, I check the gate first. Then I check it again and again. Because next time, I might not be so lucky. I still check that damn gate 3 times a night, maybe 4. The thought of someone watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, still lingers at the back of my mind, like an itch I can't scratch. But at least I got lucky. At least I saw it coming. Some people don't. Some people never realize how close they've come to danger until it's too late. Marie Thompson never saw it coming. She worked the night shift at a gas station off Highway 191 in Arizona, a long, lonely stretch of road cutting through the desert. It wasn't one of those well-lit, bustling stations with a fast food joint and a dozen pumps. No, this place was small, barely more than a convenience store with 2 ancient gas pumps that wheezed whenever they dispensed fuel. It sat on the edge of nothing, the nearest town 15 miles away, just a few flickering neon signs in the dark. A truck stop for the forgotten, for those passing through with no intention of looking back. Marie liked the quiet. Most nights were uneventful. Truckers stopping in for coffee, the occasional family stretching their legs on a long-haul drive, locals picking up cigarettes and beer. She knew the regulars, knew the way the place smelled of motor oil and stale potato chips, knew the hum of the old fridge in the back that rattled every few minutes like it was gasping for air. It was lonely, sure, but she liked the routine. The night it happened started like any other. The clock had just hit 11 p.m. when the sedan pulled up. She barely glanced at it at first, busy restocking the candy rack near the register, but when she did look up, something about the car caught her attention. It was old, covered in dust, like it had been driving for hours without stopping. The headlights cut through the dark, but no one got out. She waited. Nothing. A full minute passed, then another. The engine was off, but the driver just sat there, staring straight ahead. The glass was tinted, too dark to see his face. Marie shifted uncomfortably. Maybe he was just tired, waiting to wake up a little before getting out. But something about the stillness felt off. She grabbed her phone, checked the time. Another minute. Another eternity. Finally, the door opened. A man stepped out, moving slow, deliberate. He wore a hoodie, the fabric pulled low over his face, casting his features in shadow. He walked toward the store, his steps steady, controlled. Marie swallowed the unease rising in her throat and put on her best customer service smile. The chime above the door rang as he stepped inside. She barely looked up when he came in, pretending to rearrange the shelf behind the counter. She was trying to act normal, but her skin prickled. Something about him felt wrong. He didn't walk toward the drinks or snacks like most people. He came straight to the counter, stood there, silent. She forced a smile. "Hey there, what can I get you?" The man didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. Finally, he spoke. "What time do you close?" Her smile faltered. "We don't. Open 24/7. The man nodded, barely moving. His hoodie barely shifted. Then, after a pause that stretched too long, he asked, "How long have you been working here?" Marie blinked. That wasn't a normal question. Most people asked for cigarettes or beer or the bathroom key, not about her work schedule. A few months," she said, trying to sound casual. He didn't react, just stood there, staring. Her fingers hovered near the register, her pulse picking up. The man turned his head slightly, scanning the store. His eyes moved over the aisles, the coolers, the empty parking lot beyond the glass. "You ever get lonely out here?" The words sent a shiver through her. The way he said it, soft, almost thoughtful, made it feel less like a question and more like a statement. She forced a chuckle. "Not really. People come through all the time." The man didn't smile. Another long pause. Then, without a word, he reached into his hoodie pocket. Marie's breath caught. Her mind jumped to the worst possibility. A knife, a gun, something sharp and fast and deadly. Her fingers tensed. The man pulled out a pack of cigarettes and placed them on the counter. Marie exhaled, forcing herself to relax. Just smokes. She rang him up, her hands shaking slightly. The register beeped, the total popping up on the screen. $6.50. The man slid a few crumpled bills across the counter, his fingers brushing the wood for a second too long. Marie made the change as quickly as possible, wanting him gone. He took the cigarettes, tucked them into his hoodie, and turned toward the door. But just before he stepped outside, he paused. He glanced back, his eyes locking onto hers. "You know," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "anything could happen to you out here, and no one would hear." Marie's breath stalled. The man smiled, then he walked out. She stood there, frozen, the words settling over her like a thick fog. Her gut told her to call someone. Maybe the cops, maybe a friend, but she didn't. She just stood behind the counter, watching the taillights disappear down the empty road. 10 minutes passed, then 20. She tried to shake the feeling, convincing herself that he was just some weirdo, that nothing was going to happen. Then the chime rang again. Her stomach dropped. He was back. But this time he wasn't standing at the counter. He was at the door, staring through the glass, unmoving. Marie's breath hitched. Her hand crept toward the phone. The man lifted one hand and pressed his palm against the glass. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Then, in one sudden movement, he shoved the door open and lunged toward her. Marie barely had time to react. She stumbled back, knocking over the display behind her. The man vaulted over the counter, hands reaching for her. She screamed, fought, kicked, his fingers clamped around her wrist, yanking her forward. His breath was hot, ragged, hungry. Marie twisted, jerked free, and bolted for the back room. She slammed the door shut, locked it, her hands shaking too hard to dial 911. The door rattled as he slammed into it. Her breath came in gasps. She pressed her back against the cold metal shelf, heart hammering. Then, suddenly, silence. No pounding, no footsteps. She strained to listen. Then the sound of sirens cut through the night. When the cops arrived, they found him outside, trying to break in through the back door. They took him down fast. Marie barely heard them when they told her who he was. A fugitive, a wanted criminal who had been targeting night shift workers, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She never worked alone again, because now she knew. Some people don't just pass through the night. Some people watch and wait. Ethan never saw the man again after that night, but he never really stopped feeling him there. In the shadows, in the silence between the hum of the refrigerators, in the reflection of a darkened window when he was closing up somewhere new. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up to the feeling that someone was still watching. Maybe he was just paranoid, or maybe the man had never really stopped looking for him. Javier Mendoza didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until he started working the night shift at Desert Moon Motel in New Mexico. He'd heard the stories from the old-timers, the whispers of things that didn't make sense, the doors that opened on their own, the lights flickering in empty rooms, the guests who swore they saw something standing at the foot of their bed. He always laughed it off. This was a run-down highway motel, not a haunted house attraction. The only thing he feared was drifters and meth heads looking for a place to crash. Until the night the old man checked in. It was just past midnight when Javier first saw him. The motel lobby was empty, the only sounds the buzz of the neon vacancy sign outside and the occasional gust of wind rattling the old glass door. Then, out of nowhere, the bell on the counter rang. Javier looked up, He hadn't seen anyone come in. The man stood there, tall and thin, his skin pale and stretched too tight over his face. He wasn't carrying any bags, he wasn't even dressed for the cold desert night, just a button-up shirt tucked into slacks, old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white photograph. His eyes were dark and empty, set deep beneath heavy brows. He didn't smile. "I need a room," he said, voice low and flat. Javier swallowed. Something about him made his stomach turn, but he forced himself to stay professional. "Sure, just for the night?" The man nodded slowly. "Room at the end of the hall?" Javier hesitated. Most guests didn't request specific rooms, especially not ones as isolated as room 209. The last room on the second floor, farthest from the lobby. Not the best pick, but he wasn't about to argue. "All right," he said, punching the keys on the old computer. "Cash or card?" The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a fold of bills. Javier took the cash, counted it. The bills were crisp, old, too clean, like they'd been sitting untouched for decades. He frowned but didn't say anything. He grabbed a key off the hook, handed it over. The man didn't move right away. He just stared at Javier, long enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the lobby door. Javier didn't see a car, didn't hear footsteps on the gravel. The man was just gone. A weird feeling crawled up his spine. He shook it off and went back to scrolling on his phone, telling himself he was imagining things. Then the cameras glitched. The screen flickered, static for half a second, then came back. The hallway camera showed room 299's door swinging open, but the man never walked inside. Javier leaned forward. The camera was still grainy, but the door was moving. No wind, no hands, just creaking open on its own. He swallowed, then the lights in the lobby flickered. His stomach knotted. The motel was old, sure, but the power never did this before. He glanced at the screen again. The door to room 209 was still open. He grabbed his walkie, flipping through channels. "Hey Manny, you see that?" No response. His co-worker should have been in the maintenance room, but all he got was static. Something was wrong. He pulled up the guest registry, fingers typing fast. The system was old, but he needed to confirm something. He scrolled through the recent check-ins, looking for the man's name. There was nothing. The man hadn't signed the book, hadn't given a name, hadn't swiped a card. It was like he didn't exist. A deep, sinking fear settled in his chest. He checked the camera again. The door was closed now, but something was off. The hallway looked darker than it should have been, like the lights near room 209 weren't working. But the system showed them as on. Javier exhaled. Screw this. He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the stairs. The second floor was dead silent. The air felt heavy, thick. He walked slowly, the floor creaking under his boots. The hall smelled stale, like old cigarettes and dust. Room 209's door was shut. He reached for the knob, hesitated, then knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He fished the master key from his pocket. The second the metal touched the lock, the door swung open on its own. The room was empty. No suitcase, no clothes. The bed was still made untouched. The air inside felt colder than the rest of the motel, like the heat had never been on. He stepped inside. Something dripped. He looked up. A dark stain spread across the ceiling above the bed, seeping through the plaster, like something was leaking from the floor above. But there was no third floor. His heart pounded. He backed out of the room, turned down the hall. The lights flickered again. Then he heard it, a slow, deliberate knock from inside room 209B. He froze. The room had been empty. He had just checked. The knock came again, louder. Then a dragging sound, like something scraping across the carpet. Javier turned and ran. He didn't stop until he was back in the lobby, hands shaking as he grabbed the phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. He didn't even know what to tell them. A trespasser? A break-in? A ghost? When the deputy arrived, Javier walked him up to the room, but when they opened the door, it was locked again. Inside, nothing was out of place. No stains, no smell. The bed was perfectly made. But there, on the inside of the window, was a blood-stained handprint. Javier quit the job 2 weeks later. A month after he left, he got a call from his old manager. A guest had checked into room 209. They woke up to someone standing at the foot of their bed. The sheriff's office pulled the records. Turns out a man had died in that room 15 years ago, a drifter, found strangled, left in the bathtub. Nobody ever checked him in, and nobody ever checked him out. Javier never checked room 209 again after that night. Maybe he should have. Maybe if he had, he would have found something that made sense, something he could explain away. Instead, he left the motel, left the stories behind, and tried to forget the handprint on the window, the knock on the door, the slow, dragging sound inside an empty room. Dr. Leah Parker never believed in ghosts. Not until the night the dead moved. The morgue was quiet, the way it always was past midnight. The hum of the refrigeration units filled the air, steady, low. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and clinical, throwing long, sharp shadows across the tile floor. Leah had worked the night shift here for almost 6 years. She liked the solitude, liked the silence. The dead didn't complain, didn't ask for favors, didn't bring drama into the workplace. She was used to the occasional sound, metal settling, the hum of old pipes, the way the building shifted and creaked like it was still breathing. But this sound was different, a soft tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. Coming from locker 14, she ignored it at first. The ventilation system sometimes made strange noises, the air pressure in the cold storage shifting as the compressors kicked in. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. She looked up. The row of stainless steel doors lining the far wall gleamed under the fluorescent light. Locker 14 sat near the center. She hesitated, then walked over, pressed her fingers against the cool metal. Silence. She exhaled, shaking her head. It's nothing. She turned back toward her desk, but the second she stepped away, tap, tap, tap. She spun, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't random. It wasn't the pipes. Something was knocking from the inside. She took a slow step forward. She knew the list of bodies checked in tonight. 4 new arrivals, all accounted for. The last one, John Doe, late 50s, found dead in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. No ID, no next of kin. The police had dropped him off earlier, routine as always. He was in locker 14. Her pulse ticked up. She swallowed, her throat dry, her hands flexed at her sides. I have to check. She grabbed the clipboard from her desk, scanning the intake report. The body had been pronounced dead at the scene, transported here 2 hours ago. No signs of struggle, no indication of trauma. Just another lonely death. She pulled up the security footage. The cameras showed the usual. Empty hallways, empty morgue, nothing moving. Except the shadows in the corner of the screen seemed longer than they should be. She blinked. The shadows weren't right. She tapped the rewind button, running the footage back a few minutes. There, a dark shape, moving near locker 14. Her breath hitched. There was no one else in the building. The camera flickered. When it came back, the locker was open. Leah whipped around, eyes locking onto the row of cold storage doors. All were closed. But she knew what she'd seen. Her stomach twisted. She reached out, fingers brushing against the handle of locker 14. The metal was warm. She jerked her hand back. It shouldn't be warm. It should be cold. She should walk away, call security, call someone. But she didn't. She unlatched the door. It creaked open. The body bag inside was unzipped, empty. Leah staggered back, bile rising in her throat. She knew she had checked the body in herself. She knew it had been there. She grabbed the radio on her desk, fingers shaking as she pressed the call button. This is Dr. Parker in the morgue. I need security down here, now. Static. Then, just beneath the static, a voice. You shouldn't have opened it. The radio cut out. Her lungs felt too tight. The walls of the morgue pressed in, the air thick and cold. She turned, grabbed her keys, made for the exit. Then the lights flickered, and in the reflection of the metal storage doors, she saw someone standing behind her. A tall figure, gray skin stretched tight over hollow bones, its eyes black, bottomless. It grinned. She bolted. Her footsteps echoed as she ran down the hall, her breath sharp, ragged. She didn't stop until she slammed through the stairwell door, taking the steps 2 at a time. She didn't look back. When security arrived 20 minutes later, they found her in the parking lot, shaking, pale. She tried to explain, but what was there to say? The cameras showed nothing, the radio logs had no record of her call, and locker 14 sealed shut. No body, no record that it had ever been there at all. Leah quit the morgue 3 days later. She never told anyone what she saw, but sometimes, late at night, she still hears it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from just beyond the door. Leah never talked about what happened in the morgue, not to the police, not to her co-workers, not even to herself, when she lay awake at night, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some doors, once opened, can't be shut. Rick Saunders had spent the last 20 years driving a cab in Chicago, ferrying people through streets slick with rain, through midnight alleys and morning rush hours, through the laughter of drunks and the silence of men with things to hide. He had seen a lot, but nothing like her. It was a slow night, the kind where the meter barely ticked over and the city felt empty. He had just dropped off a fare near Lincoln Park, debating whether to call it a night, when he saw her. She stood alone at the corner of Wrightwood and Clark, just beyond the pool of streetlight, dressed in something that looked out of place. An old-fashioned white dress, the kind women wore in old photos, long and flowing, delicate. Her hair was dark, pulled back, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't wave him down, didn't move at all. But something about her made Rick slow the car, rolling to a stop just beside her. The streets were empty, no one else around. He leaned over, rolling the window down. "You need a ride?" The woman nodded. Rick unlocked the back door, watching in the mirror as she slid into the seat, silent, graceful, like she barely touched the leather. The air inside the cab turned cold. "Where to?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring straight ahead. Then, in a voice soft, almost distant, she said, 212 Harlow Street. Rick hesitated. Something about the address tickled his memory, like he had heard it before but couldn't place it. He shook the feeling off and put the car into drive. The city blurred past, streetlights casting fleeting shadows across her pale face. Rick glanced at her in the mirror, expecting her to pull out a phone, to scroll, to sigh like most passengers did. But she didn't move. She just sat there, hands still folded neatly in her lap, gaze fixed ahead. Something about her stillness made his skin prickle. He cleared his throat. "Cold night, huh?" She didn't answer. His fingers tightened on the wheel. He hated silence in the cab, the awkward weight of it pressing down. "Been waiting long?" This time she responded, but her voice was strange, not quite a whisper, not quite right. Long time." Rick frowned. He glanced at the meter. They were only 5 minutes from the address. Almost there, just a weird passenger, that's all. Then he noticed something strange, her reflection in the rearview mirror. It was there, but it wasn't quite right. The angles were wrong. Her features were blurred, like an old photograph left in the sun too long. Rick's pulse quickened. He looked back at the road, forcing himself to breathe. Almost there. Almost done. 212 Harlow Street came into view. It was a house, tucked between two others, small and unremarkable. The windows were dark, no porch light. Rick slowed the car, bringing it to a stop in front. "Here you go," he said, glancing in the mirror. The seat was empty. His blood ran cold. He turned around. Nothing. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard a sound. She was just gone. His hands were shaking. He gripped the wheel, trying to steady himself, his breath coming fast and shallow. What the hell just happened? Then he noticed the seatbelt. Still buckled. Rick's stomach twisted. Something moved behind the curtain in the dark house. Slowly, he reached for the cab's radio, pressing the button. "Dispatch? You copy?" A crackle of static, then a voice. "Yeah, Rick, what's up?" "You got an address history on 212 Harlow?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Just dropped a fare off, but something's not right." A pause, then a deeper pause. Finally, dispatch came back, voice slower now. "Careful, Rick, there's no active listing for that address. House has been empty for years." The cold in his chest spread. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Someone's home, I just saw." "Rick." The dispatcher's voice dropped lower. "You need to leave." He stared at the house, at the shadow in the window. The curtain stirred. A handprint bloomed on the glass. Rick didn't ask questions. He threw the car into drive and sped away, tires screeching against the wet pavement, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. He didn't stop until he was miles away. heart still pounding. That night, he parked the cab in the lot and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the empty back seat, trying to convince himself he had imagined it all. But deep down, he knew. He had picked up a passenger that night, a passenger who had been waiting a long time, a passenger who had finally made it home. Rick never drove that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when the roads are empty and the streetlights flicker, he swears he still sees her, standing alone at the corner, waiting. If there's one thing these stories have in common, it's this: danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lurks in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Other times it hides in plain sight, disguised as an ordinary passenger, a quiet customer, or an empty hallway. Whether it's a thief studying your routine, a stranger with dark intentions, or something that doesn't belong in this world, the night is never as empty as it seems. Derek thought he was just securing an old shipyard. Marie believed she was handling another late-night shift. Ethan figured his stalker was just another drifter passing through. Javier didn't believe in ghosts, until one checked into his motel. Leah was trained to work with the dead, but she wasn't prepared for one to move. And Rick? He thought he was picking up another fare. They were all wrong. So what can we take away from their experiences? First, always trust your instincts. Every one of these people felt that something was off. They noticed the unlocked gate, the lingering stare, the cold spot in the room, the unnatural silence. They could have ignored it, dismissed it as paranoia, but they didn't. And that choice made the difference between survival and something much worse. If you ever find yourself alone at night, feeling that uneasy prickle in your gut, don't brush it off. Your instincts exist for a reason. Listen to them. Second, be aware of your surroundings. We go through life on autopilot, assuming nothing bad will happen to us, that we're just another face in the crowd, that danger is something that happens to other people. But the truth is, most predators, whether human or not, prey on those who aren't paying attention. Keep your head up, notice the people around you, lock your doors, double-check your surroundings. Third, some doors aren't meant to be opened. Whether literal or metaphorical, there are things in this world best left undisturbed. Leah learned that the hard way when she opened locker 14.81. Javier saw it when he checked the registry. Curiosity is human nature, but so is fear. And fear is often a sign that we are trespassing where we don't belong. If something feels wrong, walk away. Finally, never assume you're alone. Just because you don't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. Whether it's a figure standing just beyond the light, a handprint on a window, or the echo of footsteps that shouldn't exist, we are never truly alone in the dark. Thank you for unlocking this latest collection of night shift horrors with us. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you, your time, your curiosity, your willingness to step into the unknown. If you have a chilling experience of your own, drop it in the comments. Who knows, maybe next time we'll be telling your story. Until then, stay safe, trust your gut, and remember, something is always watching. This has been Enigma of the Unknown. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.